Good afternoon, folks. My name is Gary. I hope you're doing well today and welcome to the show. This channel is going to be a step-by-step video series of my maintenance and restoration of the vehicle behind me, a 1970 Ford Ranchero. There will be other videos here and there of just projects I kind of feel in the mood to work on, so don't be surprised if you see some kind of unusual videos here and there, but a large majority of the videos are going to be on this vehicle because, as you can tell, cosmetically it needs quite a bit of work. Mechanically, it's in pretty sound shape and there isn't really a lot of rust, which on a unibody vehicle such as this one, that is a pretty big deal because these can kind of turn into tin cans and crunch in the middle if they're rotted out. Now, the coupe utility, or ute if you're in other parts of the world, hasn't been very popular in the United States in decades. There have been vehicles here and there made by some manufacturers that kind of fill that coupe utility role, though most of them have 4 doors instead of 2, but none of them really took off as well as things like the El Camino and the Ranchero did back in the 60s and 70s. Now, as I mentioned, they're not really that common anymore, so I figured I'd go through a bit of a history lesson as to why that happened. Why didn't a vehicle that has muscle car looks and the ability to have a 6.5-foot bed at the same time not stick around? So, having done a little bit of history and research on this myself, I figured I'd share some video clips of the vehicle with you as we talked about the history of the Ford Ranchero and of the coupe utility in general.
The coupe utility was a niche subgenre of automobile with a very interesting origin story. Most of us in the United States will likely draw images in our head of the more commercially successful Chevrolet El Camino after hearing of the Frankenstein-esque combination of a car with a truck bed. However, it'd be remiss to talk about car-based trucks without giving tremendous credit to Louis Bant, the lone designer at the time for Ford Australia. Founded in Geelong, Victoria in 1925, Ford Australia was a subsidiary of Ford Motor Company of Canada, which itself was an investment deal set up by Henry Ford to allow for the production of Ford motor vehicles in what at the time was the British Empire. Due to bank regulations for loans on vehicles, farmers in Australia would have little chance of owning a standard passenger vehicle, as they were not deemed a necessary purchase and were essentially a luxury. They could, however, receive loans for trucks or other work-oriented transportation, which led to a supposed letter from a farmer's wife in Victoria sometime in 1932. The letter ended up in the hands of Mr. Bant, with the request that, "My husband and I can't afford a car and a truck, but we need a car to go to church on Sunday and a truck to take the pigs to market on Monday. Can you help?" Finding the middle ground between passenger car comfort and style with the payload capabilities of a truck was quite an order to be had of Mr. Bant and Ford Australia. By 1934, though, the Ford coupe utility had hit the roads, fields, trails, and wherever else they were needed. This resulted in the coupe utility, or ute, becoming the stylish and affordable workhorse for many households. While there were other vehicles made in finite numbers by other companies prior to Ford's coupe utility that were similar in idea, Ford Australia's coupe utility was by far the most commercially successful. It would take nearly 25 years before the United States would see a brochure or a flyer for their very own coupe utilities, but in 1957, the Ford Ranchero hit the market. As is expected, the Ranchero was built off the chassis of another vehicle, more specifically the 10th generation full-size Ford platform. It used the shorter wheelbase variant and shared many similarities with the Courier sedan delivery model. Initial sales numbers were not very impressive, with just shy of 22,000 Rancheros hitting the roads around America. This number becomes less appealing when production numbers show Ford made close to 1.6 million 1957 model year vehicles across the entire full-size lineup. This first generation of Rancheros would continue up through 1959. The Ford Falcon would become the body platform for the second generation Ranchero, dropping in size quite dramatically from the full-size model of the late 50s down to Ford's first compact vehicle. This resulted in a total length reduction from approximately 202 inches down to 189. The Ranchero also decided to do that with its waistline as well, as it dropped from a width of 78.2 inches down to 70. The second generation would last through 1965. At this point, the Ranchero was still a submodel of the body platform it inherited from and wouldn't receive its own standalone name until the 5th generation in 1970. The third generation becomes quite complicated, as it's really a one-off affair between 1966 and 1967. This was a time where the Ranchero was sorta in between car styles, as it was mostly designed around the Falcon for the first half of production, but then started gaining more and more exterior styling design points from the classier Fairlane model. The 1967 year, with its stacked quad headlights, was quite a popular aesthetic, despite selling in lower volume compared to 1966 with the Falcon front end. The 67s are often a very desirable year and give off that strong Pontiac GTO muscle car sort of vibe, which makes more sense when it turns out that the 1967 model year was the first time the Rancheros could be considered a true muscle car. The 390 cubic inch or 6.4 liter, 315 horsepower engine was new to the model line and made short work of the former top option, which was only a 200 horsepower, 289 cubic inch V8. The Ranchero seemed to change generations just about as often as people change clothes, with Gen 4 lasting from 1968 to 1969. The Ranchero was now sharing the platform of the Fairlane and the all-new Ford Torino, which would go on to briefly become Ford's intermediate-sized muscle car for several years. The Ranchero was slowly bulking back up to its original size from the late 50s now that it had moved away from the Falcon body platform. Engines would only get larger in the Ranchero with this year, as a new top dog V8 came out in the latter half of Generation 4, the Cobra Jet Q-Code with a whopping 428 cubic inches or 7 liters of displacement and 335 horses to cram in there. While not as impressive on paper, the 1969 model year was also when two very, very well-known engines became part of the Ranchero powertrain options, the 302 and 351 Windsor engines. The 302 4.9-liter Windsor replaced the 289 from the offerings available. At this point, it's almost unsurprising to say that Generation 5 was also a very short production run. This covered the 1970 to 1971 model years and, in my totally unbiased opinion, was the pinnacle of style for the Ranchero. A pointed front end with an inset grille plus the smoothed curves of Coke bottle styling design give the 5th gen Ranchero a sleeker, more aggressive stance than prior years. This was also the first generation where a Ranchero was actually just a Ranchero and not a Fairlane or a Falcon submodel. There was plenty of power under the hood of the coupe utility at this point, as it had on offer two different big blocks, the 429 Thunderjet and the more well-known 429 Cobra Jet with its very popular shaker hood scoop. And if the sturdy little 302 Windsor under the hood wasn't quite enough for your tire melting needs, but you didn't really want a big block, you could also choose between the 351 Cleveland and 351 Windsor. Frankly, the styling of the 70 to 71 Rancheros and the Ford Torinos that they're based off of is some of my favorite of any classic car of the time period, hence why I went out of my way to find the 1970 project that I'll be working on this channel. Now that we've seen the ultimate in style, let's move on to Gen 6, where things get very unfortunate for muscle cars and big engines in general. This generation spans from 1972 up to 76, though there is a very glaring difference between the first model and all subsequent years. First, though, we do have to mention that the body style became larger in just about every aspect with this generation. While there's still a lot of aesthetic appeal and curvature to the body lines on this generation, it is noticeably a lot larger and heavier looking than the previous years. The front end of the 72 model year is quite often compared to a fish mouth or a jet intake, depending on how much you love or hate fish. It is still quite aesthetically appealing in my opinion, however things changed very quickly when 1973 rolled around. You see, federal regulations and crash safety mandates were evolving and trying to reduce vehicular injury, so one of the changes for the 1973 year was that bumpers had to offer more safety on front-end collisions. Sadly, the mid-70s was the end of the muscle car era, as fuel regulations deemed leaded high-octane gas to be too damaging to the environment and was a major health risk to humans, which meant engines would be made with lower compression ratios to avoid pre-detonation of the lower-octane fuel in the future. This had an immediate impact on the performance of engines, as lower compression, lower octane requirements basically meant less horsepower right across the board for everything. The Society of Automotive Engineers, or SAE, also decided there needed to be a more conclusive process to rating the power of engines, which now means it had to include the load and impact of accessories and emission regulations to the end result. This meant that, seemingly overnight, many engines were losing dozens upon dozens of horsepower. Incidentally, 1972 is also where I noticed they stopped touting about the horsepower and performance of engine options for your brand new Ranchero, no doubt because they could foresee how the common folk would react to such low performance numbers compared to just a year prior. The 6th generation would sadly be the death of the Ford Torino, meaning there was one last hurrah starting in 1977 for the 7th and final series of Ranchero. These were based off of the new Ford LTD2, which took over as the intermediate platform for Ford's vehicles. This in turn ended up as the largest overall Ranchero in terms of size, with a total length of 220 inches and 78 inches of width. Gen 7 lasted until 1979, and this final run of Rancheros didn't really turn things around very much for Ford, so they ended up just pulling the plug on the coupe utility dream. Gen 7 also saw the return of the stacked headlights, which hadn't made an appearance since the 1967 model. These were the last of a long line of American-made coupe utilities from Ford, with Chevrolet's El Camino and GMC Caballero hanging on to life support until 1987 when they too were cancelled. Considering that the Rancheros across all years of production sold right around 508,000 units and the El Camino alone was at 976,000, I'm not too surprised that Ford decided to cut their losses and just focus on more traditional trucks. With the early 80s, compact trucks became a very hot market that Ford would eventually wrestle their way into with the Mazda-built Ford Courier and eventually the Ford Ranger. There were likely a lot of contributing factors to the poor sales of the Ranchero, though even internally there were already issues with the idea from the start. Nowadays, it's common practice that passenger cars have to have more stringent and higher fuel economy requirements, and though Ford would sell the Ranchero and market it as a personal truck, it was always built off of a passenger car's chassis, so it's very, very likely that it had to follow passenger car-oriented regulations. I can't personally confirm that bit of information, but it would make sense on paper, at least to me. Now, there are still a lot of cars that cross that border of car-truck or truck-car hybrid or however you want to call it, and coupe utilities saw far greater commercial success in areas such as the Australian and South American markets. I doubt we'll ever see the return of a stylish coupe with a truck bed seamlessly worked into the body ever again, but the coupe utility era of vehicles brought about the importance of practical yet stylish vehicles, which is something that is unlikely to fall out of favor, and a lot of credit should be given to the innovations of the time. As I mentioned in that little trip through the history of the Ranchero, my particular project is a 5th generation from 1970. The Coke bottle styling was all the rage at that point in the late 60s into the early 70s, which I feel that Ford nailed with this body style. The contours give an aggressive profile while not being too over the top like a C3 Corvette. This particular example is a Ranchero 500 that has seen much better days cosmetically. Equipped with the fairly unkillable 302 Windsor V8 and the C4 automatic transmission, this is a pretty standard loadout and was not exactly a top model at any point in its life. Power nothing, no cruise control, heck, not even air conditioning. On the bright side, it does have power brakes and power steering, so what more do you really need in a car? That's kind of the beauty of an older, fairly cheap vehicle. There are very few features, which means there are few features that can break. Structurally speaking, the 5th generation Ranchero was the last of the unibody platforms, as later years would move on to a body-on-frame style. This means that any excessive rust can quickly become a major structural integrity problem. Thankfully, this example has a fairly limited amount of rust considering its age and for being up in Idaho. The previous owner had sprayed the entire thing with a quick coat of primer as he was in the process of stripping a lot of the old finish away, but even about a year later, I have not seen any signs of paint bubbling on any exterior panels. Underneath the Ranchero looks respectable as well if you ignore an oil pan gasket leak here and there and a potentially bad freeze plug and, old car leaks. The interior is also quite lacking, as there is just a lot of parts that are missing or not original, such as the bench seat, which was pulled from I think a 1965 Chevy Nova. Personally, missing interior parts wasn't really that big of a deal to me since I wanted to do my own thing and choose what color I put in there and put new interior stuff in regardless, so that's fine, and it means I don't have to throw anything away, which is a plus. Prior owners obviously felt the same way because this vehicle has been painted many, many times, at least 4 times from what I can tell, with someone having the genius idea of painting the steering column this gaudy royal blue for whatever reason. The original color of the vehicle was likely dark maroon, as many places in the door jambs and under the dash and under the hood still have some of that paint showing through. Unfortunately, there isn't a whole lot to tell what the interior color would have been, hence why I'm probably just going to play it safe and go with black. That way, whatever color I end up painting it won't clash with the interior. It's likely going to become a candy apple red or Wimbledon white with a new black vinyl top when I'm done with it, and of course those Ultra 70s laser stripe decals for the sides and the tailgate are basically mandatory. It'll honestly probably end up kind of just looking like a GT clone with some alternations and artistic liberty taken. One of the biggest quirks with this vehicle right now is a number of electrical gremlins, potentially caused by the replacement of the original wiring harness at some point over the years. There will be a lot of soldering that needs to get done, especially behind the dash, since basically every wire on this thing has been spliced together with crimp connectors. There's also this highly unorthodox racing panel in the middle of the dashboard, with a silly fighter jet looking switch that works as a kill switch to all the power in the vehicle, so you literally can't start the car without flipping this switch first. This in turn leads to the super sketchy possibility of someone hitting the switch while driving, which in turn cuts off all electricity to everything, so definitely a high priority of mine to get this thing out of here. Unfortunately, the reason it was put in the first place is because there is something drawing power when the car isn't running. So yeah, lots of soldering and wire chasing in my future. I've also already stripped out this nasty old spray and rubber bed liner that was in the bed because I wanted to see how bad any potential rust could be underneath. Surprisingly not bad by any means, and the bed liner would have had to come out regardless because you can't get to the top of the rear shocks unless you pull off this panel that's in the middle of the bed, so it's likely that they're very, very old. Most of the front end suspension will be getting replaced as well, as basically every grease boot is torn and pathetic looking. As I'm going for functionality and safety first, paint and cosmetic work will likely be taking a back seat for a lot of the early stages of this project. Speaking of cosmetics, this vehicle would have originally had quite a lot of chrome, which it is now of course missing. One of the prior owners decided to take off basically every piece of chrome and fill in all the holes, so I doubt I'll ever bother putting all the chrome back together on this vehicle. I might if I can find a few pieces here and there for reasonable prices, but it can be kinda tricky to hunt down random chrome pieces for a 2 model year vehicle where they only made like 20 some odd thousand of. I'll eventually have to show you folks the junkyard that I found about 10 miles down the road from my place, because it is crazy how many older vehicles are out there in that field and how many Rancheros and Torinos I've been able to just nab little parts off of here and there over the last 6 to 8 months. Anyways, I think that's a wrap for this first video and an introduction to the channel and to show you the main project. I'll be doing a ton of work on this thing, so I'll be recording all of it for videos that you folks can watch. Oh, and thank you for taking some time out of your day to check in on this little channel. I really do appreciate it. Have a great day, folks.